The grand halls of the Dragon King's palace were eerily silent. The stone walls that once echoed with the sounds of powerful roars and the flapping of massive wings were now haunted by whispers. In the heart of the palace, a dramatic change had occurred. A royal child. The heir to the Dragon King's throne lay paralyzed, his once mighty wings limp, his fiery spirit extinguished. Nothing, not even the greatest dragon healers, could lift the curse. But today, something was different. Today, a small, seemingly insignificant human maid, Ilara, stepped into the royal chamber with one goal in mind: to change the fate of the prince forever. Little did she know, her actions would not only change the prince's life, but would also alter the course of history for both dragons and humans. Deep within the Dragon King's palace, the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. The walls of the royal chambers, once alive with dragon roars and laughter, had grown quiet. The King of Dragons, a being of immense power and age, sat upon his golden throne, his eyes clouded with worry and despair. His normally commanding presence was replaced with a rare vulnerability. His son, the prince, the next ruler of the Dragon Kingdom, lay motionless in the royal bed, his wings dark and folded in sorrow. A powerful, majestic creature, paralyzed by a curse that no one could undo. The palace healers had tried everything: enchant potions, powerful spells, and even calls to the gods. But none could break the spell that had immobilized the young prince. The king, in his desperate grief, had summoned every possible expert, every ancient method of healing, but nothing worked. It was as though the prince had been abandoned by fate itself. Every night, the king would stand beside his son's bedside, staring at the once powerful prince, now a shell of his former self. His hands, which had once commanded the power of thousands, could no longer lift his own child. And with each passing day, the king's hope withered away, replaced by an unrelenting fury toward those who failed him. But among the many servants who quietly moved through the palace halls, there was one whose heart did not harden with the cruelty of life in the dragon court. Ilara, a young human maid, had watched the prince's decline from a distance. She had no magical powers, no royal bloodline, and no status beyond her role as a servant. But she had something that no one else in the palace possessed: empathy. A deep, unwavering compassion for the suffering prince. Her heart ached every time she saw him, lying motionless, his once vibrant eyes dimmed with hopelessness. It was a strange feeling for Ilara. She knew she had no right to approach the prince, let alone try to help him. Humans, after all, were considered insignificant in the world of dragons. They were mere pawns, meant to serve and obey. But as Ilara watched the prince's slow decline, something inside her stirred. She couldn't bear to watch him suffer any longer. And so, on one fateful morning, Ilara made a decision that would change everything. She gathered her courage, though her heart raced with uncertainty. As she entered the royal chambers that morning, she could feel the heavy weight of the king's gaze upon her. He had never been kind to the humans in his court, seeing them as nothing more than tools for his kingdom's needs. Yet Ilara didn't let his cold demeanor deter her. She was focused on one thing: the prince. The king, his golden eyes narrowing, watched Ilara carefully. His eyes were filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What are you doing here, human?" he rumbled, his voice deep and commanding. Ilara looked at the prince, her eyes softening. She stepped closer to the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. "I want to help him," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The king raised an eyebrow in disbelief. "Help him?" he scoffed. "You, a mere human, believe you can help my son. You have no magic, no strength. What could you possibly do?" But Ilara didn't back down. She had made her choice. "I may not have magic like your kind," she said, her hands trembling slightly, "but I can't stand to see him like this. I believe I can help him." The king's cold, scornful expression didn't change. But there was something about Ilara's words that caught his attention. He had heard many come and go in his life, all claiming to have the answers, but none had succeeded. He was about to tell her to leave, to remind her of her place as a lowly servant. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the sincerity in her voice, or perhaps it was the desperation in her eyes. For a brief moment, the king said nothing. The silence was thick with tension. Elara, standing before the prince, reached out her hand, gently placing it on the prince's arm. As she did, she felt an unexpected warmth. A faint pulse of energy surged through her. It was almost as if the prince, in his unconscious state, was responding to her touch. The king's eyes widened in shock. Could it be that there was something more to this human than he had realized? Elara looked up at the king, her voice filled with resolve. "I want to try, your majesty. Please, give me a chance." The king stared at her for a moment longer before slowly nodding. "Very well," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with a strange curiosity. "Try, but know this, human, if you fail, there will be consequences." And so, Elara, a mere maid, stood in the presence of the Dragon King with the power to change the fate of his son in her hands. What happened next would defy all expectations. The king watched from the shadows, his golden eyes sharp, as Elara placed her trembling hands on the prince. The room was silent, almost too silent, as if time itself had paused. In that moment, there was no sound except the soft rustling of the prince's wings and Elara's shallow breaths. Was she really about to do the impossible? Was this human made capable of bringing back the prince, the mighty heir to the Dragon Kingdom, from the depths of despair? The king's heart raced. Could she succeed where so many had failed? Or would this be another failed attempt to bring back the hope of his kingdom? Elara's heart hammered in her chest as she stood before the paralyzed prince. His once fiery eyes were now dull, the spark of life seemingly drained from him. His body, once a symbol of strength and power, was motionless, trapped in a prison of paralysis. Elara's hands were shaking, not from fear of the king, but from the weight of the task before her. She had never done anything like this. She had never been asked to heal, to change the course of a life as important as this one. But she had no choice. She couldn't stand by and watch the prince suffer. With a deep breath, Elara placed her hands gently on the prince's wings. His body was cold, and there was no response. For a moment, Elara felt like she was standing in the middle of a great, unyielding void. What if she couldn't do this? What if all her efforts were in vain, just another failure to add to the list? The king's eyes remained fixed on her, his cold gaze unblinking. He had never believed in humans, especially not in their ability to do anything meaningful in the world of dragons. He had seen countless humans come and go, none of them capable of anything beyond simple tasks. And yet here was Elara standing before his son, daring to believe that she could do what dragons themselves had failed to do. "Why do you waste your time?" The king's voice broke through the silence, his tone mocking. "This is no simple task. You are no healer. You cannot fix what is broken. The prince is beyond your reach." But Elara didn't back down. She couldn't. There was something in the way the prince's eyes had met hers earlier, something that stirred something deep inside her. She couldn't explain it, but she felt an unspoken connection. He wasn't just a prince to her. He was a person, a soul, in desperate need of help. Taking a deep breath, Elara began to speak softly. "I don't know how I can do this, but I believe I can. I believe he deserves a chance to heal, just like anyone else." Her words were gentle but full of conviction. The king looked on, his skepticism evident, but something in her voice made him hesitate. For a moment, he saw the determination in Elara's eyes, a mere human, standing in the face of impossible odds, willing to fight for the life of his son. Still, the king remained silent, his arms crossed, watching closely as Elara continued. She shifted her hands carefully, trying to find some warmth, some connection. Her fingers brushed over the prince's wings, and she felt a faint tremor in his body. Was it just her imagination? Or was something actually happening? Elara didn't have time to think. She focused on the prince's breathing, steady but shallow, and closed her eyes. Her mind raced with thoughts of all the things she had heard over the years about dragons and their magic. She didn't have any of it, but maybe, just maybe, the power to heal came from somewhere deeper within. Could kindness, compassion, and a willingness to fight for someone truly be enough? The silence in the room stretched on, but as Elara continued, A strange warmth began to build in her palms. She could feel it almost like a pulse, faint but growing stronger with each moment. Her heart raced faster, and she opened her eyes to look at the prince. To her shock, his wings twitched ever so slightly. The room seemed to hold its breath. A low gasp escaped Ilara's lips. She wasn't imagining it. The prince was moving. The king's eyes widened, his usual stoic expression faltering as he watched the small human. Maid make a difference where powerful dragons and skilled healers had failed. Ilara's hands trembled more now, but she didn't stop. The warmth continued to build, now spreading through her own body. It felt as though something ancient, something long forgotten, was awakening within her. Could this really be magic? Was this the power the prince needed? The king, who had watched with disbelief, slowly uncrossed his arms. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel something other than anger and frustration. He had always believed that humans were beneath the dragons, incapable of understanding the deeper forces at play in the world. But what if this was different? What if the connection between Ilara and his son was the missing link, the key to unlocking the prince's healing? But even as the prince's wings twitched again, Ilara could feel the pressure building. She had to be careful. She wasn't sure what was happening. Was this truly magic, or was it something else entirely? Either way, she knew she couldn't stop now. Suddenly, the prince's eyes fluttered open. His gaze, once dull, now held a glimmer of recognition. He didn't speak, but his eyes locked onto Ilara's. The maid's breath caught in her throat. This was at the moment where everything could change, and in that moment, the Dragon King, standing behind her, realized something that would change his view of humans forever. The healer, the one who could save his son, was not who he had expected. It wasn't a mighty dragon or an ancient sorcerer. It was a humble human maid. The prince's eyes closed once more, but this time his body seemed less stiff. His wings relaxed, his breathing became slightly deeper, and the warmth that Ilara had felt continued to flow through her hands. Growing stronger with every passing second, Ilara smiled softly. She knew this was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be difficult, but something told her that together, she and the prince could face whatever came next. Asterisk. The days following Ilara's first attempt to help the prince were filled with uncertainty. No one in the palace could deny the subtle changes that had begun in the young dragon prince. His wings twitched occasionally, his breathing deepened slightly, but the road to recovery was far from clear. Ilara, however, refused to give up. Every moment she spent with him, caring for him, made her more determined to see him heal. But despite the faint signs of progress, the Dragon King remained unconvinced. He had watched many times before as healers attempted to cure his son, only to fail. He had witnessed his son's suffering firsthand, and the king's heart had hardened. His son was his world, his pride, and now this human maid, someone he considered beneath the dragons, was daring to try something that even his most trusted healers couldn't. As the days passed, Ilara found herself spending more and more time beside the prince. She brought him meals, cleaned his chambers, and offered him kind words, even when he couldn't respond. Slowly, a connection began to form between them. Despite his condition, the prince began to recognize her presence. His eyes would follow her as she moved around the room. And sometimes, there was a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of hope in his gaze. Yet Ilara knew that it wasn't enough. The prince needed more than small gestures of kindness. He needed a breakthrough. She had heard whispers among the palace staff of a cure. Something more powerful than anything the healers had tried. The Dragon King's personal method of healing. Something so ancient and secretive that few had ever seen it in action. But it required a strength and connection far beyond the ordinary. The process was risky, and many believed it could fail entirely, or worse, it could hurt the prince further. Still, Ilara felt a growing certainty that there was no other way. The king, however, refused to consider it. He had given up hope of seeing his son walk again. His pride had been shattered, and the idea that a mere maid could help where the finest healers had failed was laughable to him. Still, he watched with growing curiosity, unsure of what to make of Ilara's efforts. She wasn't like the others. She didn't give up, and there was something in her actions that spoke louder than words. One evening, as the moonlight filtered softly through the windows of the royal chamber, Ilara stood next to the prince, her hands gently resting on his arms. She could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle energy beneath his scales, as if he were trying to respond, to fight against the paralysis that had held him captive for so long. As she stood there, her mind wandered back to the first time she had touched him. The sensation of energy flowing between them, though faint, had been enough to give her hope. Could that magic, whatever it was, be the key to his recovery? With a determined breath, Ilara made up her mind. She would try again. She couldn't live with herself knowing that she had given up, especially now that she had seen even the smallest sign of progress. "Prince," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. "I know I'm not like the healers. I know I'm just a human, but I believe in you. I believe you can get better. Please, let me help you." For a moment, there was no answer, no movement. Ilara felt a brief flicker of doubt. Perhaps it was all for nothing. Perhaps she was just wasting her time. But then, she felt it again, a shift, a subtle tremor. She wasn't imagining it. The prince's wings twitched again, more forcefully this time, and his breathing became deeper. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. Was it possible? Was this the moment she had been waiting for? With trembling hands, she moved to lift the prince. She had seen the healers do it before, move the prince gently, hold him just right, and work their magic. But they had never succeeded. Could she? As her hands wrapped around the prince's body, she felt a rush of energy, a pulse of power that surged through her. The prince's wings fluttered slightly, the tip of one wing lifting slightly from the floor. A soft, almost inaudible groan escaped his lips, as if he were waking from a long slumber. The moment was fragile. Ilara's heart raced as she focused all her energy on holding him, making sure she didn't drop him, and making sure her own strength didn't fail. She could feel the weight of the task, but at the same time, she could sense that something had shifted. The prince's body, though still stiff and uncooperative, seemed to be responding to her touch. For the first time in weeks, it seemed as though he might be able to move. Just a little. Behind her, the Dragon King stood in silence. He had seen Ilara's attempt and was unsure what to make of it. He watched as the maid struggled to lift his son, her arms shaking, but there was something different about this moment. Something in the way she held the prince, the way she spoke to him, seemed to have an effect. It was almost as if she had unlocked something within his son that no one else had been able to. The king, who had dismissed the maid as a mere servant, now felt a flicker of hope, though he was careful not to show it. Could this human really be the one to break the curse? Could she restore the prince to his former glory? As Ilara continued her efforts, the prince's body seemed to relax slightly. His wings, once rigid and unyielding, shifted ever so slightly, stretching toward Ilara's touch. His breathing, shallow at first, deepened, and a soft, almost inaudible sound escaped his lips. Ilara held her breath. She had done it. The prince was responding, and in that moment, something shifted in the Dragon King's heart. He could no longer deny the change that had occurred in his son. The power that had been dormant in the prince for so long seemed to be awakening. For the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of hope in the king's eyes. He didn't yet fully understand what Ilara had done. But one thing was certain. The impossible had begun to happen. Ilara stood there, her hands gently supporting the prince's wings as the faint tremors of movement began to spread through his body. The warmth that had started in her palms intensified, growing stronger with every passing second. She could feel it now, an undeniable pulse of energy, as if something ancient and powerful had awakened deep within the prince. His body, once still and lifeless, responded to her touch, and for the first time in weeks, the prince seemed to be fighting the curse that had imprisoned him. The room was silent, except for the sound of Ilara's quick, shallow breaths as she focused on her task. The weight of the prince in her arms was no small burden, but it didn't matter. This moment, this breakthrough, was everything. She couldn't explain the strange, almost otherworldly sensation that coursed through her. But she knew one thing for sure. She had to keep going. She couldn't stop now. The prince's wings fluttered again. a little more forcefully this time, as though they were testing their strength. Elara's heart skipped a beat. It was working. She was doing it. She could feel his muscles starting to move, even if it was just a small shift. It was more than she could have hoped for. Behind her, the Dragon King stood frozen, watching in disbelief. He had never seen anything like this. Alara, a mere human maid, was doing what no healer, no powerful dragon, had been able to do, was waking his son from the paralysis that had gripped him for so long. The king's mind raced with questions. How was this possible? What magic did Alara possess? Could a human really hold such power? As Alara continued to support the prince, she felt an overwhelming surge of warmth fill her body. It wasn't like any magic she had ever heard of. It wasn't dragon magic, not the fierce and destructive energy that dragons controlled, or was it the ancient spells of the royal sorcerers? It was something different, something pure, something connected to the prince, something only she and he shared in that moment. Suddenly, a faint glow surrounded her hands, an ethereal light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the prince's breathing. Ilara's eyes widened. This wasn't just healing, it was magic, but a type of magic she had never known existed. It wasn't the typical magic she had seen in the royal healers or the powerful dragons. No, this was something entirely different. It was as if the prince's very essence was intertwined with hers, and her emotions, her deep desire to see him whole again, were fueling the power she didn't even realize she had. The prince's body jerked slightly, and his wings, which had been limp and lifeless for so long, slowly began to lift from the floor. It was a small movement, but it was enough to send a rush of hope through Alara's chest. She couldn't stop now. She gently lifted him higher, using all the strength she had to keep him balanced in her arms. Her hands tingled with energy, and she felt a warmth spread from her fingertips to the prince's body, flooding him with life. The king, still watching from the doorway, felt his heart race. He had seen his son struggle for weeks, trapped in a paralysis that no one had been able to break. But now, in front of him, something was happening. The prince, his heir, was truly moving for the first time in what felt like an eternity. It wasn't just a twitch or a flicker of life. It was real, tangible progress. A low growl rumbled in the king's chest, a mix of awe and disbelief. He had long believed that dragons were the most powerful beings in the world, that their magic was untouchable. But here, in front of him, was a human, one of the species he had long considered inferior, doing something that defied all logic. He had to admit it. Ilara had done something he never thought possible. The prince's wings stretched further, lifting off the ground just slightly, as if they were testing the air. His eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in weeks, there was a spark of recognition in his gaze. It was faint, but it was there. His eyes locked onto Ilara's, and she could see the confusion and wonder in them. For so long, the prince had been trapped in a state of near unconsciousness, his mind clouded by pain and the curse that had taken away his ability to move. But now, as Ilara held him, as her magic connected with his body was beginning to wake up. Alara. The prince whispered, his voice weak but unmistakable. The words sent a shock through Ilara's body. She hadn't expected him to speak, not yet, not when he had been so silent for so long. The king's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his presence looming large in the room. What have you done? His voice was thick with disbelief, and there was an edge of fear in it. This was no ordinary healing. Alara wasn't just curing his son's paralysis. She was doing something far more profound. Lorraine didn't have time to answer him. She was focused solely on the prince, whose eyes were now fully open, his wings fully extended, even if only for a brief moment. She could feel the prince's pulse quicken under her touch, the warmth in his body rising. This was at the turning point. The prince was waking up, and Alara was the one who had brought him back to life. But she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up. The energy surging through her was powerful, but it was also draining. Her body trembled, and her mind was clouded with exhaustion. It felt as though her very soul was being drawn into the prince's recovery, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. "Hold on," she whispered to the prince, her voice shaky. "Please, just a little longer." And then, as if the prince had heard her plea, a miraculous thing happened. His wings flapped once, then twice, and slowly he lifted his body just slightly off the ground. It was a small movement, but to Alara, it felt like the greatest victory she could have ever hoped for. For the first time in weeks, the prince was moving. And in that moment, the king of dragons, who had once dismissed Alara as nothing more than a lowly human, felt a deep, unsettling realization settle in his heart. The impossible had happened. His son, his heir, was being healed. And it was all because of this human Maid asterisk the days following the prince's small but significant recovery were filled with tension and disbelief. Ilara's magic, whatever it was, had taken hold of the prince, awakening him from the deep paralysis that had gripped him for so long. Yet, despite the visible progress, both the prince and Alara were left with more questions than answers. What was the source of Ilara's power? How had she managed to accomplish what even the most powerful dragons and skilled healers could not? Ilara spent every day beside the prince, continuing her efforts to help him regain his strength. His movements were still weak, and his wings could barely lift off the ground. But each day, there was more improvement. His once lifeless eyes had begun to regain their vibrancy. He would look at Ilara with growing recognition, and sometimes he would even speak to her. Though his words were few and soft, but despite the progress, a sense of unease lingered in the air. The king watched with growing suspicion. It was clear that Ilara was doing something extraordinary, something that went beyond her human limits. The power that flowed through her when she touched his son was undeniable. And yet the king could not understand how it worked. Dragons were the true rulers of magic, creatures born with a natural affinity for the arcane arts. Humans, however, were not supposed to possess such power. The king had seen many humans in his time, and none had ever shown even a fraction of the magic Ilara seemed to wield. The royal sorcerer, a wise old dragon named Lyser, had been summoned to investigate. He had watched Ilara's progress from the shadows, his keen eyes narrowing every time Ilara touched the prince. He could sense the energy she was channeling, but it was unlike anything he had ever encountered. This was not the magic of dragons, nor the ancient healing spells passed down through generations. It was raw, untamed, and unfamiliar. On the fourth day after Ilara's breakthrough, Lyser finally approached the king, his expression grave. "Your Majesty," the sorcerer began, his voice low and respectful, "I have been watching closely. There is something about this maid, something ... strange. I do not fully understand what is happening, but I believe it is connected to her emotions." The king's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, Lyser?" Lyser paused, choosing his words carefully. "When Ilara touches the prince, she channels something through her hands. It's not dragon magic, and it's not the magic of the healers. It is ... a form of energy that responds to her emotions, her desires to help. It is as though her heart and mind are the conduit, not her physical power." The king looked at Lysa in disbelief. "Are you saying a human's emotions are controlling this power?" Lyser nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Majesty. It is unlike anything I have ever seen. Her emotions, her compassion, her longing to heal the prince are what seem to activate the magic. It is almost as if her own life force is tied to the prince's recovery. If her heart is strong enough, if her resolve is pure enough, it manifests as this strange power." The king stared at Lyser in stunned silence. The idea that a mere human could wield such power, especially one as powerful as the prince's, was incomprehensible. He had always believed that dragons were the true masters of magic, that their ancient bloodline gave them dominion over the forces of the universe. But here, standing before him, was a human maid whose compassion had caused a shift in the balance of magic itself. "This cannot be possible," the king murmured. More to himself than to Lyser, how can a human, a mere servant, possess such power? Lyser sighed. "I do not know, Your Majesty, but I believe that whatever Ilara is doing, it is working. The prince is improving, albeit slowly, and if she can continue to help him, there is hope." But the king's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of the revelation. He had always been proud of his bloodline, proud of his strength and his control over the forces of magic. To think that a human, someone he had once considered beneath his notice, could possess such a power, it was both unsettling and awe-inspiring. And what did it mean for the prince? Could Ilar's magic be the key to his full recovery? Could she truly heal him? Or was there a hidden cost to this power that no one yet understood? The king turned to look at his son, who lay on his bed, his eyes now alert and focused. There was still a long way to go before the prince would regain his full strength, but the changes were undeniable. The prince's wings fluttered more often now, and he had begun to speak in full sentences, his voice weak but gaining strength every day. His once brooding eyes were filled with curiosity and, perhaps for the first time, a hint of gratitude. And though his body still lacked full mobility, he was no longer completely paralyzed. The prince's recovery was happening before their very eyes, and it was all thanks to Ilara. Yet, despite the progress, the king couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time Ilara touched his son, there was a subtle shift in the air. The energy she channeled was powerful, but there was something about it that made the king uneasy. It wasn't just the idea of a human controlling such magic, it was the fact that it was tied to Ilara's emotions. What if her feelings wavered? What if her determination faltered? The king had never been one to trust humans, especially not those without power or status. But Ilara had proven herself over and over again in ways that no one else had. And as much as it pained him to admit, he knew that his son's only hope rested in her hands. "I will trust her," the king muttered, his voice filled with reluctant resolve. For now, Ilara, meanwhile, was completely unaware of the growing tension. She had been focused on helping the prince, pushing herself beyond her limits to bring him back to health. She hadn't thought much about the magic itself, only that it worked, and that it was helping the prince. She hadn't realized that her emotions, her compassion for him, were the key to unlocking the power within her. But as the days passed, she began to sense something else, something strange. Every time she touched the prince, she could feel a part of herself being drawn into him. It was as if her own life force was mingling with his, a deep connection that neither of them fully understood. Ilara's bond with the prince was growing stronger, but so was the mystery of the magic she was channeling. Could she control it? Was there a limit to her power? Or was she playing with forces far beyond her comprehension? And if the prince recovered completely, what would become of her? Would she remain the humble maid? Or would she be something entirely different, a force of magic, capable of changing the world? As the days passed, Ilara began to realize that her actions, her decisions, would shape the future of both dragons and humans in ways she had never imagined. She couldn't stop No-Not when the prince was so close to recovering. But how much longer could she hold on to this power, and what price would she have to pay for it? Asterisk, as the days passed, the bond between Ilara and the prince grew stronger. What had started as a quiet and uncertain connection, born out of Ilara's compassion for a suffering soul, had slowly transformed into something more profound. With every passing day, the prince's recovery seemed to depend more and more on Ilara's presence. It wasn't just her touch that healed him, it was her unwavering faith, her quiet determination, and the strength of her heart. She had given him more than just care. She had given him hope. The prince, whose once dull and distant eyes had been filled with the emptiness of pain, now looked at Ilara with a spark of curiosity and gratitude. He wasn't able to speak much yet, his voice still weak and fragile, but when he did, his words were always filled with thanks. Every time Ilara entered the room, his gaze followed her, and she could see the recognition in his eyes. He no longer saw her as just a servant, as a mere human maid. He saw her as someone who had restored his will to live, someone who had given him a future when he had none. Ilara had grown used to the prince's quiet presence. She had come to enjoy their brief conversations, even when his words were few. As the days turned into weeks, she found herself speaking to him more, sharing stories of her life before she came to the palace, telling him about the world outside the cold, towering walls of the Dragon King's castle. And though the prince could not yet speak with strength, he listened intently. His eyes would brighten whenever she spoke, and occasionally he would smile, just the faintest curve of his lips, but to Alara. It was everything. The king, however, still remained distant, unsure of what to make of the connection between the maid and his son. He had always been a ruler who trusted power, true power, born of bloodlines, dragons, and magic, but what Alara had done seemed to defy every rule he had lived by. She had no bloodline, no magic, and no title. And yet here she was, doing what no dragon had been able to do. What was more troubling was the growing affection between her and the prince. The king knew that if this bond grew stronger, it could complicate everything. There was a part of him that felt grateful for her efforts to heal his son, but there was another part of him, one that feared the consequences of a human and a dragon growing too close. One evening, as Alara sat beside the prince's bed, she noticed a change in him. He was no longer as fragile as he had been in the beginning. His movements were more confident, his wings now twitching and stretching on their own. His once dull eyes were now bright and alert, filled with the fire of life. Though he still couldn't walk, the prince was regaining his strength, bit by bit. It was clear to Alara that the magic she had unknowingly tapped into was growing stronger. But what was most surprising was the way the prince seemed to be changing emotionally. He was no longer the broken, silent figure who had first caught her attention. He was more like the dragon he was meant to be, a leader, someone with courage and pride. "Alara," the prince whispered one evening, his voice stronger than it had been before. He looked up at her with an intensity that made her heart race. I don't know how to thank you." "For everything," Alara smiled softly, a mixture of relief and warmth flooding her chest. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. I couldn't bear to see you suffer." The prince looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing his words carefully. "You gave me more than just healing," he said quietly. "You gave me a reason to fight again. I had almost given up. I thought I would never move, never speak again. But because of you, I'm starting to believe that I can." Alara's eyes softened as she looked at him, her hand reaching out to gently rest on his. His scales, once cold and unresponsive, now felt warm beneath her fingers. There was a subtle strength in him that hadn't been there before, a strength that made her believe more than ever that he would recover completely. The prince's gaze never left hers. "I don't understand it," he continued, his voice filled with a sense of wonder and uncertainty. "What is it that you're doing? How are you able to bring me back when no one else could?" Alara paused, unsure of how to explain something she herself didn't fully understand. "I don't know," she said softly. "It's not magic, not in the way you think. It's something more, something I feel deep inside. It's not just about healing your body. I think it's about healing your heart too. When you were in pain, I couldn't bear it. I wanted to see you well again more than anything." The prince nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've never met anyone like you, Alara. You're not like the others. You don't treat me like an heir to a throne or a mighty dragon. You see me for who I truly am." Alara's heart skipped a beat. His words were simple, but they held so much meaning. For so long, she had only seen the prince as a broken figure, someone she could help, someone she could heal. But now, she saw him as someone who was truly beginning to recover, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The bond between them was no longer just a healer and a patient. It had become something deeper, a connection built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. As she sat there, holding his hand, Alara couldn't help but wonder what the future held. She had never expected any of this. She had never imagined that a human maid like herself could play such a pivotal role in the life of a prince. But now, as she looked at him stronger, more alive than he had been in weeks, she knew one thing for certain. Their lives were intertwined in a way neither of them could deny. But despite the growing bond between them, Alara knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The king, though grateful for her help, would never fully accept the relationship between her and his son. There were forces at play, political forces, that neither Alara nor the prince could ignore. But for now, all that mattered was the bond they shared, the quiet strength they had built together. Alara looked at the prince, her heart filled with quiet hope. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I promise." And as the prince's wings fluttered gently in response, Alara knew that they both had a long journey ahead, but they would face it together. Asterisk as Alara continued to care for the prince. The progress was undeniable. Every day, he grew stronger, more alert. His once lifeless wings were now flapping with increasing frequency, the muscles regaining strength, though he still had a long way to go. But there was more than just physical healing happening. The connection between Alara and the prince had deepened, and with it, a new understanding began to form one neither of them could have predicted. Though Alara had no magical training, she had discovered that the magic she wielded was tied to her emotions. The prince's recovery wasn't just about her touching him or speaking to him, was about her heart, her belief in his healing. But this bond, as powerful as it was, had begun to raise more questions than answers. And with every day that passed, Alara found herself questioning the limits of her power. How far could she push herself? What would happen when the magic she was channeling reached its limits? One evening, as Alara sat at the edge of the prince's bed, the quiet hum of the palace felt different. The royal chambers, usually calm, felt heavy with an uneasy silence. Alara had been caring for the prince for weeks, but now a feeling of dread grew inside her. It was like something was coming, something she had been avoiding. The prince noticed her discomfort. His eyes, still bright but now full of concern, fixed on her. "Alara," he whispered, his voice weak but urgent. "What's wrong? You're not acting like yourself." Alara looked down at her hands. They were warm from touching the prince's scales, but her body was exhausted. The constant flow of energy she gave to him was starting to drain her. She had always given so much, but now she felt something strange happening inside her. She wasn't sure what it was, but it scared her. "I'm scared," she said softly. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." The prince's expression softened. His wings twitched slightly. "You've already given me more than anyone ever could," he said quietly. "You've given me a chance to live again? I don't want you to suffer because of me." Alara's heart broke at his words. She could see the worry in his eyes, but she knew the truth. The magic she had used to heal him was powerful, but it came with a price. She didn't fully understand it, but every time she used it, she felt her strength fading. She was giving so much of herself to him, and it was slowly taking its toll. The king, who had watched Alara's work from a distance, had begun to notice the effects. He had seen the miracles she performed, saving his son from death's door, but now he also saw the cost it was having on her. The way Alara kept pushing herself to heal the prince made him worried about her. He had seen her growing weariness, and he knew the bond between Alara and his son was growing stronger, something that could change both of their lives forever. One evening, after Alara had spent hours beside the prince, the king called for her. She entered his chambers cautiously, her heart heavy with the weight of what had been building. The king's cold eyes were fixed on her as she stepped into the room. "Alara," the king began, his voice deep and full of authority. "I've watched you closely. Your work has been nothing short of extraordinary. You've given my son back something we thought was lost forever. But I need to understand something." Alara held her breath, not knowing what the king would ask. She had never hidden anything from the prince, but the king's question made her uneasy. "What is it that you are doing to him?" the king asked. "What power do you have?" Alara hesitated. Her hand shook a little. She had always been honest, but she didn't fully understand the magic either. She had acted out of pure compassion, a desire to help the prince, but now she realized she didn't know enough to explain it clearly. "I don't fully understand it." "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "all I know is that when I touch him, when I believe in his healing, I feel something in me. It's not the same magic as yours. It's a bond between us. When he hurts, I feel it too. And when he gains strength, I feel that strength with him. It's like our souls are connected." The king's eyes widened in surprise. For a moment, his usual coldness softened. He had known there was something special about Alara, something beyond what any human should have. But hearing her explain this connection between them made him realize how deep it went. This wasn't just about healing. It was something more, something that connected them in ways he couldn't fully understand. "Alara," the king said gently, "you are giving so much of yourself to my son. I know it's not just your magic that's healing him, it's your heart. but I fear that you are sacrificing too much. If you continue, you may destroy yourself." Alara felt her heart ache at his words. She had been so focused on helping the prince that she hadn't noticed how much it was costing her. She hadn't realized how much her own life force was being drained. The king continued, his voice now filled with regret. "I can't lose you too, Alara. My son needs you. But he also needs to understand that you can't heal him at the cost of your own life." Alara felt the weight of the king's words. She had always known the bond between her and the prince was powerful, but now she understood how much it was costing her. It wasn't just a gift, it was taking something from her piece by piece, Alara. The king said softly, "If you wish to keep helping my son, you must learn to control this power. You need to find balance, or it will destroy you both." Alara nodded slowly, feeling the burden of the choice she now had to make. She had given everything to the prince. But now she had to decide. Heal him without losing herself. Now step back and let the bond fade. As she left the king's chambers, her mind was filled with doubt. She had discovered something incredible. But at what cost? Could she continue to help the prince without losing herself completely? The question weighed heavily on her heart. The days after her conversation with the king weighed heavily on Alara. She had always known that the power she wielded, this strange, unexplainable magic, was more than just a simple healing force. It was connected to her heart, her emotions, and her deepest desires. But now, faced with the king's warning and the growing toll on her own body, Alara found herself questioning everything. Could she continue to help the prince? Could she do so without sacrificing herself entirely? The prince had continued to recover, his movements becoming stronger with each passing day. His wings, which had once been paralyzed, now flapped with growing force. His eyes, once dim with pain, were bright with life and determination. There was no denying the miraculous change that had occurred. But as Alara watched him, her heart filled with both joy and fear. The prince was healing, but with every day that passed, the cost to Alara seemed greater. She could feel her own energy slipping away, and it terrified her. As the days turned into weeks, Alara grew weaker. The magic she was channeling, this unspoken, this untrained force, was slowly draining her, pulling her energy and strength from within. She could feel it in the way her limbs trembled when she reached out to help the prince. She could see it in the way her vision blurred and her body ached. The connection she had formed with the prince was growing stronger, but it was also becoming more dangerous. She had given everything for him, but how much more could she give before there was nothing left of herself? The prince, sensing the change in her, began to grow more concerned. One evening, as Alara sat beside him, resting her head against the cool stone of the wall, he reached out and gently took her hand. "Alara," he whispered, his voice full of concern. "You're not well. I can feel it. You've given so much to me, but you're growing weaker every day. You don't have to keep doing this. I don't want you to sacrifice yourself for me." Alara's heart clenched at his words. He was right. She had given everything, and now there was nothing left to give. She had been so focused on helping him, on healing him, that she had ignored the cost to herself. But she couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to being fully healed. Not when he was so close to being whole again. "I'm not giving up," she said softly. Her voice tinged with determination, though it shook with the strain. "I can't stop now. You've come so far, and I've made a promise to you. I will see you through this." But even as she spoke the words, Alara knew she was lying. She didn't have the strength to go on much longer. The prince had regained his strength, his wings now fully restored. But Alara felt as though she was slipping further and further away. She couldn't afford to ignore the truth anymore. That night, after the prince had fallen into a deep sleep, Alara sat by the window, staring out at the stars. The palace was quiet, the only sound the soft rustle of wind through the trees. She closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her, trying to find some semblance of peace. But in the silence, she realized something. The power she had channeled, this bond between her and the prince, wasn't just a curse. It was a gift. She had healed him, yes, but in doing so, she had changed herself. The bond they shared had transformed her in ways she couldn't have imagined. She had been afraid of losing herself in the process, but now she saw the truth. She had given everything because she had believed in him, and that belief had been enough to change both their lives forever. Ilara knew what she had to do. She had to let go. The next morning, she stood beside the prince's bed, her hands trembling as she reached out to him for one final time. His eyes opened slowly, and for the first time, he looked at her with complete understanding. "Ilara," the prince whispered, his voice stronger than it had ever been before. "You've done it. You've healed me. You've given me everything. But now, you need to let go." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes as she looked down at him, her heart breaking. She had been so afraid of what would happen when the magic stopped, when the bond between them was broken. But in that moment, she realized that her sacrifice had not been in vain. The prince was whole again, and he no longer needed her in the way he once had. "I'm proud of you," Ilara whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "You're strong. You're going to be okay." The prince reached out, his wings gently brushing against her arm. "You've given me everything, Ilara. Now it's my turn to give something back." With that, the prince's wings flapped powerfully, and he rose from the bed. Standing tall for the first time in what felt like forever, Ilara watched in awe as the prince, once broken, now stood proud and strong. He had regained everything: the strength of his wings, the power in his eyes, the confidence in his posture. But it was more than that. He had regained himself, and he was no longer the prince who needed saving. And as Ilara looked at him, she realized that the real miracle wasn't just the healing of the prince's body, it was the healing of both their souls. Through their connection, they had both been changed. The prince had found his strength, and Ilara had found her courage. Together, they had unlocked something far more powerful than magic. They had unlocked the power of sacrifice, of love, and of trust. With a final, tender smile, the prince stepped forward and took Ilara's hand. "You've saved me," he said softly. "Now, let me save you." Ilara smiled, the weight in her heart lifting. She had given everything to him, and in return, he had given her a new life, a life she could now live for herself. And as they stood together, side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, Ilara knew one thing for sure: their journey was just beginning. The bond they had formed, the strength they had shared, would carry them forward, no matter the obstacles. They were no longer just healer and patient, but two souls bound together by a force far greater than anything either of them could have imagined. It was a new beginning, one full of hope, love, and endless possibilities.